The day Eudora Carter rode into Slater's Creek with nothing but a broken-down wagon, a milk cow named Bess, and $300 sewn into the hem of her dress, the whole town stopped breathing for just long enough to make her feel exactly like what she was, a woman alone in a world that had very little patience for such a thing. It was the spring of 1878, deep in the Kansas territory, where the wind came off the plains like it had a grudge against everything standing upright, and the sun had a way of turning even the most hopeful faces leathery before their time. Eudora was 29 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned under a sun-faded bonnet, and gray eyes that had seen enough in the last 2 years to make them look considerably older than the rest of her. She was not a small woman in spirit, though the journey from Missouri had whittled her frame down considerably, and the grief of losing her husband Thomas to a fever the previous autumn had done the rest. Thomas Carter had been a good man, the kind who wrote lists and kept them, who believed in careful planning and the virtue of patience. He had saved for 4 years to make the journey west, had purchased a land claim sight unseen from a man in St. Louis who turned out to be less than honest, and had died 6 months before they ever made it to Kansas. He left Eudora with the wagon, the cow, his surveying tools, a Bible, and a land claim that, when she finally tracked down the county office in the nearest town of Millhaven, turned out to be completely invalid. The land had already been deeded to someone else nearly a decade prior. The clerk at the county office, a thin man named Harold Pitt who wore his suspenders too tight and his opinions too loud, had looked at Eudora's paperwork over his spectacles and told her flat out that there was nothing he could do. The claim was fraudulent. The man who sold it to Thomas had taken advantage of Eastern settlers who didn't know the difference between a real deed and a printed piece of paper with official-looking seals on it. It was a common enough scheme, Harold Pitt said, not unkindly, but without any particular warmth either, and Eudora had thanked him and walked back out into the Kansas afternoon and sat on the step of her wagon for a long time without moving. She had $300. She had the cow. She had the tools. She had her own 2 hands and a stubbornness that Thomas had always called her finest quality, even when it drove him absolutely mad. It was the liveryman in Millhaven, a big-shouldered fellow named Cecil, who mentioned Jasper Slater. "There's a rancher out past the fork, about 7 miles northeast," Cecil said, working a piece of straw between his teeth while he looked at the sorry state of her wagon wheel. "Name of Slater, Jasper Slater. Man's got more land than he knows what to do with. Runs cattle mostly, but there's good crop ground on the south end of his property that nobody's touched in years. He's a solitary sort of man, don't talk much, don't suffer fools, but he's fair. You want my honest opinion, it's the only lead worth following in this county if you're looking to farm." Eudora looked out at the flat, wide Kansas sky and decided she had not come this far to turn around. She found the Slater ranch on a Tuesday afternoon when the light was going amber, and the prairie grass was catching it in a way that made the whole world look like it was made of copper. The ranch house was a solid, handsome thing, built from good lumber with a covered porch that ran the whole length of the front. There were outbuildings, a barn, a smokehouse, a bunkhouse set back near the tree line, and a working corral where 3 horses moved in lazy circles. The fence lines were clean. The yard was not fancy, but it was orderly, and Eudora had enough sense to know that what a man's property looked like when he wasn't expecting company told you more about him than anything he might say to your face. She pulled up at the gate and called out, because you did not ride onto a man's property in 1878 Kansas without announcing yourself first if you wanted to stay on good terms with your health. Jasper Slater came around from the side of the barn with a hammer in his hand, and a look on his face that was neither welcoming nor unfriendly. He was taller than she had expected, somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than any natural advantage, broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that jutted up out of the creek beds around here. He wore a plain canvas shirt rolled to the elbows, leather work gloves tucked into his belt, and boots that were worn but well kept. He squinted at her wagon and then at her, and he didn't say anything right away, which she took as a good sign. Men who talked first and thought second were the ones you had to watch. Mr. Slater, she said, and she kept her voice level because she'd had enough practice by now. My name is Eudora Carter. I'm a widow out of Missouri, and I've been told you have land on your south boundary that isn't being worked. I'd like to put a crop in if you'll allow it. I can pay fair rent or work it on shares, whichever suits you better. I'm asking for 1 season. Just 1 season, and I'll be no trouble to you. Jasper Slater looked at her for a long moment. The hammer hung easy in his hand. There was a crease between his brows that might have been suspicion or might have been thought, and she genuinely could not tell which. You come out here alone, he said. I did. From Missouri. Yes. He looked at the cow tied to the back of the wagon. He looked at the wheel that was wobbling worse than it had any right to. He looked at her hands on the reins, work roughened, capable, steady. That south field hasn't been turned in 6 years, he said finally. Ground's going to be hard. I've broken hard ground before, she said. Another long pause. A meadowlark called somewhere out in the grass, bright and strange in the silence between them. There's a soddy on the east edge of that parcel, Jasper said. Built it myself some years back, hadn't got around to tearing it down. It'll need some work before it's fit to live in. Eudora's heart did something careful and quiet inside her chest. I can manage that. He nodded once, the way a man does when he's made up his mind and sees no point in making a ceremony of it. I'll show you the property line in the morning. You can set up in the barn tonight if you want. It's going to rain before midnight. He turned and walked back around the side of the barn without asking for her answer, as if he already knew she'd say yes, and there was no need for the formality of it. Eudora sat on the wagon seat for a moment longer, the amber light lying warm across her face, and felt something shift in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than that. The specific and particular feeling of a door opening when you had begun to believe all the doors were closed. She said yes, obviously. She pulled the wagon around to the barn. The rain came exactly when Jasper Slater said it would. The soddy on the east edge of the south field was not much to look at, a low structure built into a slight rise in the land, with walls of stacked sod bricks and a roof of the same covered over with boards and more sod on top of that. The door was a good solid one, which told her whoever built it had understood what mattered, and there was a single window facing south that let in the morning light. The floor was packed earth. There was a rusted stove that needed a new flue pipe and a rope-strung bed frame with no mattress. Mice had made themselves comfortable, but the walls were thick and the structure was sound. And when Eudora walked the perimeter of it on that first morning, with the dew still on the grass and Jasper Slater standing a respectful distance away with his arms crossed, she felt something that Thomas would have recognized and been glad of. She felt the particular kind of hope that comes from a problem you know how to solve. I'll need a new flue pipe for the stove, she said. I've got one in the barn, he said. The window needs its oil paper replaced. I can bring oil paper from Millhaven when I go Friday. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the soddy with a critical eye, as if he were cataloging what needed doing and already deciding how to help, which she found strange and touching in equal measure. Mr. Slater, I want to be clear that I intend to pay my own way, she said. The flue pipe, the oil paper, I'll pay for those things. The flue pipe was already in my barn, he said. And the oil paper costs less than $1. Don't make a quarrel out of a kindness, Mrs. Carter. Eudora stared at him for a moment, and then, to her own absolute astonishment, she almost laughed. Not the polite kind of laugh women were expected to produce in company, but a real one, short and surprised. She caught it before it fully escaped. No, she agreed. I suppose I shouldn't do that. Something moved across Jasper Slater's face. It was very brief and she might have imagined it, but it looked almost like the beginning of a smile. He showed her the property lines that morning, walking the full extent of the south parcel with her, explaining the soil character, the drainage, where the spring sat that would give her water for irrigation, where the old fence line ran that marked the boundary of his cattle range, so she would know to keep her crops on the near side of it. He talked about the land the way some men talked about horses, with a quiet respect that told you he understood it, not just as property but as a living thing with its own rhythms and requirements. She asked questions, and he answered them directly, without condescension, which was rarer than it ought to have been. The south field was everything Cecil the liveryman had promised, and everything Eudora had hoped for. The soil was dark and rich under the first couple of inches of hard crust, river silt, that had been depositing itself here for 1,000 years before anyone thought to farm it. It was going to be hard to break, but once broken it would give her back more than she put in. She could see corn here and squash and maybe wheat if she was lucky with the rains. She could see, in the abstract way that only a farmer could see, what this land was capable of being. She got to work. The first week was the hardest thing she had done since burying Thomas. Breaking 6 years of hardened prairie sod with a walking plow behind a borrowed mule, Jasper lent her the mule without making a fuss about it. Just appeared one morning leading a solid gray animal and said he wasn't using him, was the kind of labor that showed you exactly where your limits were, and then suggested you exceed them anyway. Her hands blistered and then calloused. Her shoulders screamed. She fell asleep each night on the straw mattress she'd assembled from materials in Millhaven before she'd fully finished eating her supper. But the rows went in, one after another, straight and true, because Thomas had taught her how to sight along a fence post and keep your line, and she'd always been a quick learner. Jasper Slater appeared at the edge of her field on the third morning and watched her work for a while without speaking. She was too tired and too focused to be embarrassed by it. Finally he walked over, looked at her rows, and said, "You're pulling left on the uphill. You'll lose your line on the second acre if you don't correct it." She looked at the rows. He was right. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and walked back to his own work. That became the pattern of those early weeks. He appeared occasionally, never intrusively, always with something useful to offer, an observation about the soil, a piece of equipment she might borrow, information about the weather patterns in this particular valley that he had learned from 11 years of watching the land. He never lingered. He never made her feel watched. He had a quality she came to think of as respectful presence, the ability to be helpful without being overbearing, to care without imposing. She learned things about him in fragments. He had come to Kansas from Tennessee as a young man of 22, with a horse and a bedroll and enough determination to make up for everything else he lacked. He'd built the ranch from nothing, working cattle drives for other men first, saving every dollar, buying his first 100 acres when he was 25 and adding to it steadily since. He'd had at various points 2 ranch hands, but they had both moved on the previous fall, and he was running the place alone now, which explained a great deal about the contained, self-sufficient quality he carried. He'd never been married. He didn't explain why, and she didn't ask. She learned these things not from any conversation that could have been called intimate, but from the accumulation of small exchanges over days and then weeks, the way you learn the character of a place by living in it rather than by being told about it. He brought the oil paper from Millhaven on Friday, as promised, along with a pound of coffee and a small crock of lard that he set down on her porch step without explanation. "Mr. Slater," she said, coming to the door with her hair loose because she hadn't expected anyone. "Cecil at the livery said your coffee ran out," he said, already turning to go. "Man talks too much." She stood in the doorway of the soddy and watched him walk away across the spring grass, and she pressed her lips together against something that was not quite a smile and not quite an ache, and was maybe a little of both. Her first social engagement in Slater's Creek came the third Sunday in April, when a woman named Margaret Fowler appeared at the edge of the south field in a bright yellow calico dress and introduced herself as the wife of the hardware merchant in Millhaven and the person who ran the Ladies' Aid Society for the surrounding district. Margaret Fowler was a round, energetic woman of about 40 with a forthright manner and kind eyes, and she told Eudora flat out that she had heard about the widow woman farming Slater's south field and had wanted to come out and get acquainted before anyone else did, because other people's first impressions were not always reliable. "Word is already going around that you're Jasper Slater's woman," Margaret said, without any particular delicacy, settled on an upturned crate in the soddy doorway with a cup of Eudora's coffee in her hand. Eudora kept her expression perfectly even. "I am a tenant on Mr. Slater's land. That is the entirety of the arrangement." "Of course it is," Margaret said in a tone that suggested she was reserving judgment. "And how is he treating you, as a landlord?" "Fairly," Eudora said. "Honestly, I have no complaints." Margaret nodded slowly, looking at Eudora with the particular attention of a woman who was good at reading people. "He's a decent man," she said finally. "Keeps to himself too much. Always has. His mother passed when he was young, I heard, and his father was the sort who didn't see much use in sentiment. Makes a man closed up, that does." Eudora said nothing to this, but she filed it away. By the end of April, the corn was in the ground and the squash hills were mounded and planted, and Eudora had begun to feel something unfamiliar settling around her. Not contentment, not yet, but its outline. The shape of a life she could build. The soddy had become genuinely comfortable with her attention to it. She had whitewashed the interior walls with a lime mixture, hung a piece of cotton cloth across the window for curtains, and planted a small kitchen garden just outside the door where she put in beans, onions, and a row of marigolds, because Thomas had always said flowers weren't practical, and she had always said he was wrong about that. She began to see Jasper Slater more regularly, in the natural way that proximity creates. She took to leaving a covered plate on the fence post nearest the path to his barn when she cooked more than she could eat, which happened often because she cooked the way her mother had for a family, out of habit. He never acknowledged it directly, but the plates were always returned clean, and once or twice she found something left in exchange. A small jar of honey from a hive he kept behind the barn, a piece of cured ham wrapped in cloth, a bundle of dried herbs tied with kitchen string. It was the beginning of May when they had their first real conversation. Not about the land or the weather or the practical business of crops and tools, but a real conversation, the kind where you learned something about the inside of a person. She had gone to the spring to fill her water pails in the evening and found him there already, sitting on the bank with his boots off and his feet in the water, looking out at the last of the sunset with the expression of a man who was thinking hard about something that gave him no pleasure. He startled when he heard her and moved to stand, and she said quickly, "Don't get up on my account," and sat down on the bank a few feet away from him and set her pails down. They sat in silence for a while, which was not uncomfortable, and then he said, "Your rows are looking good." "The corn's taken well," she agreed. "I was worried the frost last week had done damage, but it held. This valley runs warmer than the open plain," he said. "The creek holds heat. You lose a couple weeks off the danger of late frosts in spring and gain them back in fall. It's why I settled here." "You knew that when you chose the land?" He was quiet for a moment. "No, I learned it. The first winter I was here I lost half my cattle to a blizzard I hadn't prepared for. The second year I was ready." He paused. "You learn the land or the land teaches you. Either way you learn." Eudora looked at the water moving over the stones. "My husband believed in planning," she said. "He had a plan for everything, lists and timelines and contingencies." She stopped. "He didn't plan on fever." The silence that followed was not pitying, which was why she didn't mind it. "I'm sorry," Jasper said, not elaborately, just that. "Thank you," she said. And then, because it seemed right to say it, he would have loved this land. He was a surveyor by trade. He understood the geometry of landscape, the way it held water, the way it drained. He would have seen exactly what you saw when you chose this valley. "Sounds like a man worth missing," Jasper said quietly. Eudora looked at the water for another long moment. "He was," she said. "He really was." They stayed by the spring until the light was almost gone, talking with the easy, irregular rhythm of people who have found, to their mutual surprise, that they are comfortable with one another. He told her about the cattle drive he'd worked as a young man going through Abilene, the sheer improbable spectacle of it, 2,000 head of longhorns and a crew of men who were equal parts competent and reckless. She told him about her father's farm in Missouri, the creek that ran behind it, the way the whole world smelled like wet earth and apple blossoms in May. He listened the way people rarely listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually following the shape of what she said, asking questions that showed he'd heard the details. When she finally stood to take her water pails back, he stood too and carried one of them for her without asking, all the way to the soddy door. She thanked him. He said good night and walked back across the dark field, and she stood in her doorway watching the darkness swallow him up in thought. There is a great deal more to that man than appears on the surface. June arrived the way June always did in Kansas, gloriously, and then brutally, the sweetness of the first weeks giving way to the kind of heat that pressed down on you like a physical weight by early afternoon. Eudora learned to rise before the sun and work until 10, rest through the worst of the midday heat, and go back out when the shadows began to lengthen. It was the rhythm the land required, and she fell into it. The crops were thriving. The corn was knee-high by the first week of June, dark green and vigorous, and the squash vines were running in every direction with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of young things that don't yet know they have limits. She had chickens now, 6 of them, purchased from a farm wife in Millhaven for 50 cents apiece, and Bess the cow had settled into the small pasture beside the soddy as if she had always intended to end up in Kansas. Eudora had also, in the weeks since the Springside conversation, discovered something she had not anticipated. She looked forward to seeing Jasper Slater. Not in a complicated way, she told herself. In a simple, practical way. He was interesting to talk to. He knew things. He made her think. That was all it was. She was not entirely convincing, even to herself. He began appearing at the fence line with more regularity. Sometimes he came with a practical excuse. He'd noticed a section of her field fence was down. He'd seen a coyote in the area and thought she should know about her chickens. He'd found a tool in his barn that would be useful for what she was doing. Sometimes he came with no excuse at all, and they both pretended by unspoken agreement that there was no need for one. He was teaching her, gradually and without making a lesson of it, the specific character of his land. Which patches of ground held moisture longest, where the wind came from in a storm and which direction to expect trouble, where the best grass grew for hay and when it needed cutting. He talked about the land the way a man talks about something he has loved for a long time, carefully and specifically, and Eudora understood that this was a significant thing he was sharing. There was an afternoon in mid-June when a storm came up fast from the southwest. The kind that builds in an hour and hits like a fist, and Jasper appeared at her field just as the sky turned that particular greenish yellow that all Kansas people learned to respect. He didn't say much. He helped her get Bess and the chickens secure in the small barn she'd built out of salvage lumber, and they'd barely made it inside themselves when the sky opened up with a ferocity that made conversation impossible. They sat in the barn in the semi-darkness with rain hammering the roof and lightning making the world outside look like midday in bad flashes, and Bess shifted nervously in her stall and the chickens complained, and Eudora and Jasper sat on a hay bale with perhaps 2 feet of space between them and listened to the storm have its say. "Does it always hit this hard?" she said, when the thunder had passed far enough that she could be heard. "No," he said. "Sometimes it hits harder." She looked at him sideways and found him watching the rain come through the barn door with that focused, calm expression she had come to know. He was not afraid of the storm. He respected it, which was a different thing. "Were you afraid?" she asked. When you first came out here, before you knew the land, he thought about it seriously, the way he thought about most things. I was 22 years old, he said. I didn't have enough sense to be afraid of the right things, but yes, a pause. There was a night the first winter when I was alone in that house and the wind was so bad I thought the structure would come apart. I sat up all night with my rifle across my knees, which would have done absolutely nothing useful, but it made me feel better. He stopped. I was afraid then. After that, I started learning what there was to be afraid of and what there wasn't, and it got easier. Eudora found herself smiling at the image of a 22-year-old Jasper Slater sitting up all night with a rifle against a wind. What was there actually to be afraid of? She asked. The things you can't prepare for, he said simply. The things you couldn't have known. After enough years, you run out of most of those. Or they've already happened and you survived them and they stop being terrifying. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain was gentling. I've run out of being afraid of most things, she said, and she meant it. I was afraid when Thomas died. Afraid of being alone, of being without income, of what would happen if the plan failed. All of it. And then all of it happened, and here I am. She looked at her own hands, roughened from weeks of work. And here I am, she said again, more quietly. She felt more than saw Jasper shift on the hay bale beside her, turning slightly toward her. Here you are, he agreed. There was something in his voice that she did not know how to name. Warmth, maybe, or recognition. The sound a person makes when they see someone else clearly and what they see pleases them. Eudora did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the rain. But she was aware, with a clarity that surprised her, of exactly how close he was sitting. The warmth of him in the cool, rain-soaked air. She told herself again that this was a simple thing, a practical thing, a matter of proximity and circumstance. She was becoming, she suspected, an excellent liar. The 4th of July celebration in Millhaven was a serious affair, the biggest social event the county had to offer, and Margaret Fowler arrived at the Soddy 2 weeks in advance to inform Eudora that she was expected to attend, and that there would be absolutely no discussion about it. There was a picnic, a band, a shooting competition, and a dance in the evening at the Grange Hall, and the whole county turned out for it. Eudora went because Margaret Fowler was the kind of woman who made refusal feel impolite. She wore the best dress she owned, a dark blue merino wool that was too warm for July, but was the most presentable thing she had. And she pinned her hair up properly for the first time in weeks, and looked at herself in the small square of mirror she kept on the Soddy wall and thought that she looked respectable, if not particularly festive. She had not known, until she arrived and turned around at the sound of her name, that Jasper Slater would be there. He was wearing a clean white shirt and a coat, which was so unexpected that she actually stopped walking for a moment. He looked different, cleaned up and among people, still himself, still quiet, still carrying that contained quality about him, but there was something else too. He was not unhandsome, she realized with a start. She had known this in an abstract way, the way you know a landscape is beautiful when you are too busy working it to stand back and look at it. But standing here in the Millhaven street with the bunting flying and the band striking up a fiddle tune, with him crossing toward her with something that was definitely a real smile, not the shadow of one she'd seen before, but an actual full smile that changed his whole face, she felt it differently. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I didn't know you were coming." "Mrs. Fowler is persuasive," she said. "She is," he agreed. "I've been avoiding this event for 6 years. She wore me down this year." He looked at her for a moment, just a second longer than strictly necessary, and then he offered his arm. "Would you let me show you around? I know most of these people." She took his arm. She was aware of the eyes that followed them, and she suspected Margaret Fowler was somewhere in the crowd being smug about it, and she found she didn't much care. He knew everyone, as it turned out. He introduced her simply, "This is Eudora Carter. She's farming my south parcel." But the way he said it had a quality to it, a quiet steadiness, that made it feel like something more than a business arrangement even when it was phrased as one. People received her warmly, or at least politely, and she could see that his endorsement carried weight in this community, which told her things about how he was regarded. They watched the shooting competition, in which Jasper came in second place by a fraction to a young man of about 20 who turned out to be the blacksmith's apprentice. They ate at the long tables set up in the street, and he brought her a plate and sat across from her, and they talked and ate, and she laughed twice at things he said, really laughed. And each time it happened she saw that expression cross his face again, that open, almost unguarded thing that appeared when she laughed, like a window opening in a closed house. The dance started as the sun went down, the fiddler joined by a man with a banjo and a woman at an upright piano that had been hauled out of the Grange Hall onto the step. The music was exuberant and unsophisticated and entirely joyful, and half the county was on their feet before the first song was done. Jasper Slater, it turned out, could dance. It surprised her completely. He had given no indication of it, and it seemed inconsistent with everything she'd observed about him, until she realized it wasn't inconsistent at all. He moved through a dance the same way he moved through everything, with economy and quiet competence, but he clearly loved it. He danced 2 reels with her, and then a slower waltz that the fiddler played last, when the evening had gone velvet dark and the lanterns were lit, and in the waltz they were close enough that she could smell the clean cotton of his shirt and feel the steadiness of his hand at her back. "You didn't tell me you could dance," she said. "You didn't ask," he said, and there it was again, that small smile, private and warm just for her. She looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the fiddle sang, and the lantern light caught the angles of his face, and Eudora Carter, who had told herself very firmly that she was here for 1 season and 1 season only, felt the ground shift under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the Kansas earth. She did not say anything about it. Neither did he. But when they drove back under the stars, he'd insisted on escorting her, said the road was poor at night and the wagon wheel was still a risk. He sat beside her on the wagon seat, and the quiet between them was different from any quiet they had shared before. Warmer, more conscious. At the soddy door he helped her down from the wagon, which was not strictly necessary, and he held her hand a beat longer than the action required. And then he let go and stepped back and said good night with the careful, deliberate manner of a man who is not doing something he very much wants to do. She thought about that, lying in the dark on her straw mattress, for a very long time. July deepened and the crops grew with a determination that filled Eudora with the particular pride of having made something from nothing. The corn was going to be excellent. She could see it now with certainty, the strong stalks and the fullness of the developing ears. The squash had gone completely riotous, vines running 10 and 15 feet in every direction, the fruit swelling. She'd put in a late stand of beans that were climbing their poles with admirable enthusiasm. She was going to have a good harvest, better than she had hoped for even, enough to justify her winter, possibly enough to put something away toward next year. She caught herself thinking it and then stopped because she had said 1 season. She had asked for 1 season, and Jasper Slater had granted it. She had not asked for more, and he had not offered more, and she had no business building plans around a next year that she had not negotiated and had no guarantee of. But the thought kept coming back, because the land was good and she was good at working it, and because leaving at the end of the harvest season would mean leaving behind the spring with the good clean water and the valley that ran warmer than the plain and the barn she'd built, and the kitchen garden she'd planted, and the marigolds that were blazing orange and yellow along the soddy wall. Leaving would mean leaving Jasper Slater. She worked harder. When you were thinking things you didn't want to think, hard physical labor was the best remedy available. It was in the 2nd week of July that she noticed trouble. She'd gone out at dawn to walk the corn rows, the way she did every morning, checking the plants for signs of pest or disease or damage, and she found the south end of the field, the end nearest the road, had been disturbed. Not by animals. The damage was too deliberate. Several rows of corn had been trampled, not broken by the weight of a deer or a coyote, but deliberately walked through, the stalks bent and broken in a line that suggested a person walking across rather than along the rows. And near the field's edge, there was a burned patch in the grass that had no natural explanation. She stood looking at it with her jaw set and her hands at her sides, and then she walked to the main ranch house and knocked on Jasper Slater's door. He opened it in his work clothes, clearly already up, coffee cup in hand, and he took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" she told him. He walked back with her and surveyed the damage without speaking for several minutes, crouching at the burned patch, looking at the way the corn had fallen. "You have any trouble on the road yesterday?" he asked. "No. But I was in the north part of the field most of the day. I wouldn't have seen anyone at the south end." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a man named Harlow Briggs who farms 2 miles east," he said. "He put in a bid on this parcel last fall when I was thinking about selling it. I didn't sell. He took it poorly." Eudora looked at him steadily. "Do you think it's him?" "I don't know," Jasper said carefully. "I think it's worth paying attention to." He rode out that same afternoon, and she did not ask where he went, but he came back in the early evening with a set expression that had replaced the usual calm, and he told her that he'd spoken to Harlow Briggs, who had denied knowing anything about it. He'd also spoken to the county deputy in Millhaven, who had noted it down and said he would keep an eye out. "I'm going to move the horses to the corral closer to your field at night," Jasper said, "and I'll be keeping closer to the south boundary for a while." "You don't need to do that," Eudora said quickly. "This is my problem." He looked at her with a directness that cut right through the protest. "Your field is on my land," he said. "That makes it my problem too." She opened her mouth and closed it again. There was nothing unreasonable in what he'd said. The property was his. His protection of it was entirely logical. That it felt like more than logic was something she kept to herself. The trouble came again, 5 days later. This time it was a section of her field fence, pulled down in the night, and in the morning she found that her chickens had gotten into part of the crop. 2 of them were missing, and there were tracks in the soft ground near the fence that were human, not animal. Eudora found Jasper at the pulled-down fence at first light, having beaten her there. He was crouched studying the tracks with an expression she had not seen on him before, not anger exactly, but something colder and more resolved. "I'm going back to the deputy," he said. "And if the deputy won't do anything useful," she asked. He looked up at her. "Then I'll handle it myself." She believed him, which was both reassuring and slightly alarming. But in the end, the deputy, pushed by Jasper's second visit and by the physical evidence of the fence and the tracks, did ride out to Harlow Briggs's property, and Briggs, apparently deciding that official attention was more trouble than the harassment was worth, stopped. There were no more incidents. The south field was left alone. Eudora had lost perhaps 1/5 of the corn on the south end. She did not let herself be angry about it, for very long anger was expensive and she had work to do, but she was grateful, in a way that settled deep and stayed, for the fact that Jasper Slater had stood between her and that trouble without making her feel like a burden for it. She told him so one evening at the fence line. "Thank you," she said, "for how you handled that." He seemed genuinely surprised. "It was on my land," he said again. "You know that's not all it was," she said, and she held his eyes when she said it, and she felt the color come up in her face a little, and she made herself stay steady under his gaze. Something crossed Jasper Slater's face that she recognized now. That unguarded quality, the window opening. "No," he said quietly. "It wasn't all it was." And they looked at each other for a moment that was longer than any of the others, and then the evening wind moved through the corn and broke the spell, and they each looked away and nothing more was said. But something had been said, even in the silence, that could not be unsaid. August came in burning and golden, and the harvest season was beginning to announce itself. The corn was ready. She started cutting in the first week of August with a hand scythe, working from before sunup until the heat drove her inside, and on the 3rd morning Jasper appeared at the field edge with a second scythe, and without any preamble whatsoever began cutting the row parallel to hers. She looked at him. "I've got my own work to do after noon," he said by way of explanation. "I didn't ask for help," she said. "No," he agreed and kept cutting. She worked beside him in silence for a while, and then she stopped fighting it and just let herself be grateful. And after a few minutes they fell into a natural rhythm, two people working the same ground in the same direction, and it was easy and companionable and good. They talked as they worked, or didn't talk, by turns. He told her about the early years of the ranch, the setbacks and the small victories, the year he'd almost given up and gone back east and what had stopped him. She told him about growing up on her father's farm, about learning to read with her mother by firelight because the schoolhouse was 2 hours away, about the particular feeling of a thing she'd made with her own hands succeeding. They talked about Kansas, about the territory debates, about statehood, about what this part of the country was becoming. He was more politically aware than she'd expected, thoughtful and measured in his opinions. He worked beside her every morning for a week. They cut the corn, then the hay she had let grow along the south field's edge, then dealt with the squash, which required careful handling and a great deal of back bending that made both of them straighten up periodically and press their hands to their lower backs in the universal gesture of the seasonally employed. The squash harvest was where she started laughing first. She was trying to get a particularly enormous specimen. It had to weigh 30 pounds at least free from its vine, which had a death grip on it, and she was on her knees in the dirt pulling with both hands and the vine was winning. And Jasper came over and grabbed the vine end while she pulled the squash. And for a moment they were in a genuine tug-of-war with a vegetable. And then the vine released all at once, and she went backward into the dirt with the squash on her chest, and he nearly fell forward. And they looked at each other across the ridiculous situation, and she burst out laughing. Really, genuinely laughing, the way she hadn't in longer than she could account for. He started laughing too, really laughing, not the shadow of a smile she'd learned to watch for, but actual laughter, sudden and warm and completely unguarded, and it transformed him so entirely that she felt she was seeing the real person for the first time. The man under all the careful containment. They were both sitting in the dirt of the squash field with a 30-pound vegetable between them, laughing, and the sun was going copper in the late afternoon, and Eudora Carter thought, "I am in love with this man." She thought it clearly and fully, without surprise, as if some part of her had known it for quite some time, and was only now permitting the conscious realization. She stopped laughing slowly, catching her breath, and Jasper stopped too, and they looked at each other with the honesty that sometimes comes right after laughter, when your face hasn't had time to rearrange itself into its daily expression, and she could see that he knew it. Could see that he was feeling something that mirrored what she felt, the same careful terror of it. He stood up and dusted himself off and picked up the squash without looking at her. "This one's going to last you the whole winter if you keep it right," he said. "I know how to keep squash," she said gently. "I know you do," he said, and then quietly, "I know you do." There was so much more in it than the words. Harvest wound down through the end of August and into September, and Eudora put up what she could: dried corn, stored squash in the cool of the Sadi's north corner, canned beans in jars she'd bought from the general store, dried herbs from the kitchen garden hung in bundles from the Sadi ceiling. She sold what she couldn't keep at the Millhaven market, and when the accounting was done she had, after all her expenses, $140. Not a fortune, but proof. She sat with the money on the table in the Sadi one September evening and looked at it and thought about what it meant. She had done what she set out to do. She had put in one season as she had asked. The season was ending. The season was ending, and Jasper Slater had never once mentioned it. Not once. Through the whole summer, through the work and the storm and the trouble with Harlow Briggs and the harvest and the laughter in the squash field and the evenings at the spring and every careful, accumulating moment of being near him, he had never said a word about the agreement expiring, had not asked what her plans were, had not indicated, by word or by any remoteness of manner, that he expected her to leave. She found this extraordinary. She also found it terrifying, because a woman in 1878 Kansas who was paying attention to her own safety did not simply remain on a man's land past the agreed period without a conversation, however much she might wish to. She had to speak to him. She went to the ranch house on a clear September evening, the kind where the sky looks like a painting, all purple and gold, and the air smells of the end of summer, and she knocked on his door with the specific courage she kept in reserve for things that scared her. He opened the door and looked at her, and something in her face made him step back from the door in a silent invitation. She came inside for the first time. The ranch house interior was exactly what she would have expected, spare and functional, but with a quality of care about it. Good furniture, worn but solid, a bookshelf with an actual collection of books, a fireplace with a clean hearth, no frills and no softness, but nothing uncared for. She stood in the center of the room and turned to face him and said, without preamble, "The harvest is in. The season is done. You have never said anything about what comes next, and I need to know what you intend." He stood a few feet away, his hands loose at his sides, watching her with that direct brown gaze. "What do you want to come next?" he said. This was, she realized, a perfectly fair question. And in the wild west of it all, there was really only one honest answer she could give, so she gave it. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to plant again in the spring and farm that field for as long as the land and the arrangement will allow. I want to stay in this valley because it suits me and I have made something here that is worth continuing." She stopped. "That is the practical answer." "And the other answer," he said quietly. She looked at him steadily. Her heart was beating, with an authority that made it difficult to concentrate. "The other answer is that I have spent the summer trying very hard not to feel what I feel when I am near you, and I have been completely unsuccessful, and I think you already know that, and I think—" She stopped again. "I think you may be in a similar position." The silence stretched. Outside, something called in the dusk, some prairie bird. Jasper Slater crossed the room in 3 measured steps and stood directly in front of her, and she had to tip her head slightly to look at him, and his expression had that open quality at its fullest, completely unguarded now, all the careful containment gone. "I let those ranch hands go last fall," he said. "I told myself it was economics. But the truth is I knew you were coming." She stared at him. "You couldn't have known I was coming." "Not you specifically," he said, "but I knew something was coming. I've been alone in this valley for 11 years, and last fall I started feeling it the wrong way. Started feeling like something was missing that I hadn't noticed before." He paused. "And then you rode up to my gate with your broken wagon and your cow, and I showed you the land and watched you look at it the way I looked at it the first time I saw it, and I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought she belongs here." Eudora felt her breath catch. "Jasper, I should have said something sooner," he said. "I've been careful about it because I didn't want to put you in a position where you felt you owed me something. You didn't owe me anything. The land was fair. The arrangement was fair. I didn't want—" "Stop," she said gently. "You didn't pressure me. You gave me room and time and fairness, and I know what that cost a man of your nature. That is not a small thing." Something moved in his face, a releasing. "Stay," he said. "Not as a tenant, stay." A pause. "I am asking you something more than that, and I know it. And I know it's fast, and you're still carrying Thomas with you. I understand that. And I am not asking you to set him down. I'm asking you—" He searched for words, and she could see that this kind of speaking was genuinely difficult for him, the words coming from somewhere unaccustomed to being accessed. "I'm asking if there is room." Eudora Carter, who had come to Kansas with nothing but $300 in her hem and a widow's grief and a stubborn desire to make something from nothing, looked at this man who had given her land and time and quiet respect and the specific, steady kindness of a person who shows up for you without requiring you to ask, and she felt something settle in her chest that was so much lighter than grief, something that breathed. "Yes," she said, "there is room." He kissed her then, carefully at first, the way a man kisses a woman he has been thinking about for a long time and wants to get right. She put her hand against his chest, felt his heart beating fast under the cotton of his shirt, and thought, "There it is." They were married in November, when the harvest was fully in and the first cold had come down from the north, and Millhaven's little church was decorated with dried flowers and corn husks, because those were the things available, and they were beautiful in their own right. Margaret Fowler cried, and then denied crying. Cecil from the livery was there and looked gratified, as a man does when a piece of advice he gave proves correct. The minister who married them was a young man newly arrived from Ohio who was clearly taken aback by the straightforwardness of the occasion, but performed his duties with warmth. Eudora wore the blue merino wool dress because it was the best she had, and Jasper wore the coat from the 4th of July dance. He stood at the front of the church with his hands behind his back and watched her walk up the aisle, and his expression was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life, completely unguarded, completely open, every careful wall gone, just a man looking at the person he loved. She reached him and took his hand, and his fingers closed around hers with a steadiness that was everything she'd come to know about him expressed in a single gesture. They said their vows in plain, quiet voices, and it was real. The first winter of their marriage was the best kind of difficult. The Kansas winters were not gentle things. The wind found every gap in every structure. The cold came in serious and stayed. The sky went the color of pewter for days at a time. But the ranch house was well built and Jasper kept it warm, and Eudora discovered that 11 years of a man living alone in a space left specific marks on it that a woman with opinions could improve upon, and she did so with his bemused and genuine cooperation. She moved the bookshelf so the morning light hit it. He approved. She put curtains in the front windows, proper ones, good cotton, not oil paper. He said it looked better. She planted bulbs along the front porch in October, tulips and daffodils, pressing them into the cold ground on faith that the spring would bring them up, and he came out and watched and then went and got a trowel and helped without being asked. They talked. That was what she had not expected. Not that she hadn't known he could talk. She'd watched him do it, but the volume of it, the depth and range and constancy of it, once the careful distance was gone. He told her things he had kept stored for 11 years of solitude, and she told him things she had kept stored for a year and a half of grief, and they talked through long winter evenings by the fire with their feet on the same footstool, her with her mending and him with whatever he was reading, and the talk and the silence were equally good. She learned that he had a dry, quiet humor that appeared often now that he'd stopped being careful. She learned that he had a precise and detailed knowledge of the natural world around him, the species of birds in the valley, the behavior of the creek in different seasons, the particular geology of the land they were on, that he shared freely, and with an infectious enthusiasm that she loved. She learned that he was a devoted reader with a wide-ranging taste, and that he had ordered books from a bookseller in Topeka regularly for years. And she borrowed his books, and he borrowed her opinions on them, and they disagreed about certain things with the pleasure of two people who trust each other enough to argue. She learned that he was a man who showed love primarily through actions, through doing and providing and being present, and that this was a language she knew how to speak and receive. And she learned, watching him across the table and at the fire and in the barn at morning chores, that he was one of those rare people who became more themselves in the presence of being loved, the way some plants open in sunlight, not performing contentment, but genuinely expanding into a version of himself that had been waiting for the right conditions. She loved him thoroughly and specifically. That was the truth of it. Winter also brought a clarity about the land and what they would do with it come spring. Over the kitchen table, with a lamp and pencils and the deed to the property spread out between them, they made plans together. The south parcel, Eudora's parcel, as it had begun to be called by the people of Millhaven, though the deed said Slater on it, would be expanded. They would clear the scrub along the east tree line and add another 40 acres to the cultivated ground. Jasper had been thinking of reducing his cattle operation anyway, and the crop income from last summer had impressed him. They would run it together, the ranch and the farm, as one integrated thing, with his beef operation and her crop production feeding into each other and the market in Millhaven. He did not tell her what to do with the land. He asked her. He sat at the table and said, "What do you think will grow best on that east section?" and listened to her answer the same way he'd listened to everything she said since the beginning, as if it mattered, which it did. They were, she realized, genuinely building something. Not her season on his land, their life. By the time the spring came, and the tulip bulbs she'd planted on Faith came up red and yellow and extravagantly beautiful along the porch in April, she was carrying their first child. She told Jasper on the porch, on a morning when the daffodils were also open, and the meadowlark that lived somewhere in the south pasture was doing its level best to claim the whole morning with sound. She had planned to say it carefully, had rehearsed the words, but in the event she just turned to him while they were both looking at the flowers and said, "We're going to have a baby." He went very still. "When?" he said. "October, I think." He turned to look at her, and his face did the thing she loved, went entirely open. He said nothing for a moment, and then he reached out and put his hand against her face very carefully and just held it there. His palm was warm. "Eudora," he said, "just that." "I know," she said, and leaned her cheek into his hand. The planting season that second spring was the best kind of joyful. They worked the expanded south parcel together, Jasper clearing the east section through March and early April, while Eudora planned the layout and prepared the seedlings in the soddy, which was now being used as a proper growing house rather than a dwelling. She had put the pots and trays in the south window and grown the corn starts under the spring sun, which would give them a 2-week head start over direct seeding, and had been, she told Jasper, a technique her father had used in Missouri. The new field hands they had taken on for the season, 2 brothers from Indiana named Walt and Roy Pemberton, solid, young, and hardworking, had made the clearing manageable, and by mid-April the east section was broken, and ready, and Eudora was walking her rows under the spring sky, feeling the stretch and pull in her back that was both pregnancy and labor, and was perfectly fine. Jasper tracked her condition with a focused concern that was touching and occasionally excessive. He appeared at intervals during the working day to check that she had water. He rearranged the barn so that the milk stool was at a better height. He read every piece of information available to him about pregnancy. This turned out to be limited, since this was 1879 and most of what was available was vague and superstitious, and then applied a pragmatic common sense to the subject that she found considerably more useful. "You should not be pulling the plow this season," he said one morning. "I wasn't going to," she said, because she had already decided this herself. "Good," he said, and looked relieved. She guided. Walt and Roy did the heavy pulling. She was in the field every day, directing the planting with the specific authority of someone who had proven herself the previous season, and the Pemberton brothers, to their credit, took her direction without question. She suspected Jasper had said something to them about it beforehand. The summer moved with a grace that seemed improbable given how much they had both been through to get here. The crops went in and grew. The cattle operation ran. Millhaven saw them regularly, at market, at church on Sundays now, at Margaret Fowler's periodic social events, where Eudora had become a genuine member of the community, rather than the new widow woman people were watching with cautious interest. She was no longer the new widow woman. She was Eudora Slater, and the community had accepted her with the practical thoroughness of people who respect competence and plain dealing, which were qualities she had demonstrated in sufficient quantity. Margaret Fowler threw a party for her in August and made a cake that Eudora could not stop eating, which Margaret said was a good sign. The baby came in the early hours of an October morning, when the leaves were turning, and the air had that particular autumn sharpness that made everything feel significant and clear. Margaret Fowler was there, had been there since the previous evening, having developed, through some sixth sense that community women of her type cultivate, an awareness that tonight was the night. Jasper was there, which was not the standard arrangement but was entirely consistent with his nature. He sat through the long hours of it with a composure that was genuine rather than performed, and he held Eudora's hand when she needed him to and moved out of the way when Margaret needed him to. And when, just before dawn, the baby made his arrival and announced it with the full authority of his new lungs, Jasper made a sound that she would never forget, a small, involuntary sound of pure wonder, quickly caught. A son. They named him William Thomas Slater. William for Jasper's father, which she had suggested, and Thomas for hers, which Jasper had suggested without prompting, and the specific rightness of that second name made her eyes fill for a moment that was about grief and about gratitude in equal measure. Jasper held the baby with the careful intensity of a man holding something he cannot believe is real, and she watched his face from the pillow and loved him more than seemed reasonable. "He looks like you," Jasper said quietly. "He has your chin," she said. Jasper looked at the baby and then at her. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I don't know how to be a father." "Nobody does," she said. "You learn the land or the land teaches you." He recognized his own words and something shifted in his face. He looked down at William again with an expression that was equal parts terror and love, and the particular determination of a man who has decided he will master this thing as he has mastered every other thing that has been placed before him. He did. He was not a demonstrative father in the loud and obvious way of some men, but he was steady and present and genuinely interested in the person William was becoming from his first weeks of life. And William, fat and healthy and opinionated from the beginning, seemed to recognize the quality in his father and responded to it with a trust that was absolute. The years settled around them the way good years do, with enough difficulty to keep life honest and enough goodness to make the difficulty worthwhile. They had a second child when William was 3, a daughter they named Clara Rose, who arrived in spring and seemed to have been designed by nature specifically to make her father helpless. Jasper Slater, who had spent 11 years being contained and self-sufficient and unmoved by sentiment, turned out to be the kind of man who could be completely undone by a little girl in a sun hat asking him to help with her buttons. Eudora found this endlessly and thoroughly satisfying. The farm grew. They added the east acreage, and then in the 5th year, a further section to the north that Jasper had held undeveloped for years. They hired permanent help. Walt Pemberton stayed on, having decided he preferred Kansas to Indiana, and they added a woman named Della to help in the house and with the children, which freed Eudora to do what she genuinely preferred, which was to be in the field. She was regarded in the county by now as one of the better farmers in the district, which was something that would have been unremarkable anywhere else. But in 1879, Kansas carried a specific weight, because women who farmed were not entirely uncommon on the frontier, but women who farmed competently and profitably and with acknowledged expertise were fewer. She had something to say about soil management and seasonal timing and crop rotation that the men at the county agricultural meetings Margaret Fowler had persuaded her to attend found useful, even if some of them had to work through their initial reservations about the source. Jasper, who had attended 2 of these meetings at her side, had addressed those reservations in a way that was pure Jasper Slater. He had said nothing at all. He had simply sat beside his wife and listened to her speak with the focused attention of a man who expects what he is hearing to be worth his time, and the people in the room had registered this, and it had been, in its quiet way, its own kind of advocacy. She loved him for it, she told him so. "You would have managed without me," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "But I didn't have to, and that matters." He looked at her in the particular way he had, direct and warm and still carrying, even after years, a quality of wonder at her, as if she continued to surprise him, which she supposed she did as he surprised her. "No," he said, "you didn't have to." It was in the 7th year. Clara was 4. William was 7. The farm was running at its best. The ranch was solid and paying. That Eudora went back to the county office in Millhaven on a Tuesday afternoon, and had a conversation with a different clerk than the one who had told her the land claim was invalid. And she came home with a document that she spread on the kitchen table that evening, while Jasper was putting the children to bed. He came downstairs and found her at the table with the document in front of her and a lamp lit close to read by, and he sat down across from her and looked at the paper and then at her. "I've been doing some reading," she said. The Homestead Act of 1862 allows a claim of 160 acres to the head of a household, and as of a ruling in 1875, widows and women over 21 are eligible to file in their own right. She paused. "The south parcel is 120 acres. The additional 40 we cleared is within the acreage limit. I could have filed a homestead claim on it in my own name from the start." Jasper was watching her with calm attention. "I know," she said, "that the land is yours, the deed is yours. I'm not suggesting otherwise. I am simply noting that I could have had a legal claim of my own, and the system had provisions for it that were not clearly communicated to a widow woman who arrived here not knowing the territory, and I think—" She stopped. "I think there's something worth saying about that, about how many women like me came through here and didn't know what was available to them, who were told their claims were invalid and didn't know to push back or to look further." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking about doing?" he asked. "I'd like to write a letter," she said, "to the county agriculture office about making information available about what women who come here are entitled to under the law." She met his eyes. "I know it's not, I know it may come to nothing." "It may," he agreed. "Or it may not." He looked at the document. "Write it." She wrote 3 letters that month and the next to the county office and to the territorial government and to a women's newspaper published out of Topeka that Margaret Fowler had introduced her to. She received 2 replies. One was dismissive. The other was from a woman at the newspaper who said she would like to print Eudora's account if she was willing to provide it. She was willing. It came to something. Not a revolution. The world did not turn on its axis in a moment, but something. The letter was printed. 3 women wrote to Eudora over the following year, asking questions about their own situations, about what their rights were, about what was available to them. She answered every letter. She connected 2 of them with the county clerk who had been genuinely helpful, and one of those women filed a successful homestead claim on land she had been farming for 2 years without legal protection. Jasper read the letter when it was printed and said nothing for a while and then said, "I'm proud of you." She looked at him. "Are you embarrassed by it, the attention?" He seemed genuinely surprised. "No," he said. "Why would I be?" "Some men would be," she said. "Some men," he agreed, "have foolish reasons for the things they feel." And that was all he said about it, and it was enough. The 8th year, the one that would stay clearest in her memory for reasons that had nothing to do with the land or the crops or the letters, was the year William, 8 years old and already fascinated by the surveying tools that had belonged to Thomas Carter, and lived in the soddy where Eudora still kept her growing house, asked Jasper why there was a stranger's name on the surveying kit. Eudora was at the stove and she went still. Jasper, who was sitting at the table with the newspaper, set it down carefully and said, "Come here, Will." And William came, and Jasper told him, clearly and simply, the way he did everything about Thomas Carter, who had been Eudora's first husband, a good man and a surveyor who had died before he could get to Kansas, who had loved maps and careful plans, and who had given Eudora the start of her knowledge of the land even before she got here. William listened with the focused attention of a serious child. Then he said, "So he's why you know so much about the ground." Eudora turned from the stove. "Partly," she said. "He taught me some things, and then I learned the rest." William considered this. "And then you met Pa, and then I met your father," she agreed. William seemed satisfied. He took the surveying kit back to the soddy with a care for it that he hadn't quite had before, and Eudora looked at Jasper across the kitchen and found him looking at her with that expression. The open, warm, unguarded one. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning the conversation, meaning all of it. "He should know," Jasper said simply. That night, lying in the dark with his arm around her, and the house quiet and the Kansas wind moving through the grass outside, she said, "Are you happy?" It was the kind of question that could sound fragile but didn't, not coming from her and not going to him, because they had enough honesty between them to make it a real question seeking a real answer. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was thinking genuinely rather than stalling. "Yes," he said, "in the specific way that I didn't know what this felt like before, so I didn't miss it. And now I know what it is, and I miss it when it's temporarily absent, like when you go to Millhaven and the house is quiet." She smiled in the dark. "That's a very specific definition of happiness." "I'm a specific sort of man," he said. "You are," she agreed. "It's one of my favorite things about you." His arm tightened briefly around her, the way it did when he felt something he didn't have words for, which was its own kind of language, and she had become fluent in it over years of learning him the same way he had taught her to learn the land carefully, specifically, with the understanding that the most important things were not announced but revealed. Clara was 5 when she declared, with the absolute confidence of a child who has not yet learned to doubt herself, that she was going to be a farmer like her mother. She made this announcement at the dinner table and looked at both her parents with an expression that dared them to contradict her. Eudora looked at Jasper. Jasper looked at Eudora. "That sounds right to me," Jasper said. "Good," Clara said, and went back to her beans. William, who had been developing an interest in the cattle side of things and had already spent 2 seasons alongside Jasper learning the ranch work, reached over and patted his sister's hand with the generous condescension of an older brother who is secretly proud. Clara removed his hand from hers. The harvest of the 9th year was the biggest they had ever brought in. The expanded north acreage came into its full production. The corn was extraordinary, the wheat was excellent, and the market price was good. Jasper spread the account books on the table at season's end, and they sat together and looked at the numbers and then at each other. "We should expand the growing house," Eudora said. "Build a proper greenhouse structure. Glass and frame, not just the soddy and oil paper." "Yes," he said. "And I want to sink a proper well on the east section, so we're not depending on the spring irrigation for that ground." "Agreed," she said. "William should go to school in Millhaven next year, properly. The teacher there is good." "He won't want to," Jasper said, with the experience of knowing his son. "No," she agreed. "But he'll go." William went. He complained about it for 2 weeks and then stopped because he had discovered that the teacher in Millhaven had books about geography and surveying and land measurement that William would happily have lived inside, and after that the trip to town was no longer a hardship. They built the greenhouse. It was not an elaborate thing by any later standard, but it was real glass panes set in wood frames, a proper structure that extended the growing season by 6 weeks in either direction, that let Eudora grow things she hadn't been able to grow before. She put in tomatoes and peppers and started her seedlings earlier and bigger than she ever had, and the first spring morning she walked into the greenhouse and felt the warmth of it close around her, the smell of the soil and the green growing things. She felt a satisfaction so complete and physical that she had to stand still in it for a moment and just breathe. She had come here with nothing. She had asked for 1 season. And it had become this: the greenhouse, the fields, the children, the house, the husband who read at the same table where she wrote her letters, who taught William to rope and Clara to sit on a horse properly, who had told a ridiculous joke about the squash at dinner last week and made everyone at the table dissolve, who walked the land at dawn sometimes, the same way he had done for 11 years before she arrived, but now she was beside him. She had not expected any of this. She had expected 1 season. It was a Sunday morning in the 10th year, a clear and crystalline October morning, with the cottonwoods turned gold along the creek, and the sky that particular autumn blue that looks like it goes on forever. That Eudora Slater looked across the breakfast table at her family and felt the full weight of it. William, 10 years old and serious in the way of children who have thought carefully about the world, was reading at the table, which she and Jasper allowed because he would do it in any case, and pretending otherwise was not practical. Clara, 7, was telling the table at large about something she had observed in the field yesterday involving a ground squirrel, with the narrative enthusiasm that had characterized her since she learned to talk. Jasper was at the stove, because on Sunday mornings he cooked breakfast, which was a habit they had fallen into early in their marriage, and she had never discouraged because he made very good biscuits, and she saw no reason to disrupt a functional system. She sat in the morning light with her coffee and watched them all and felt not happiness as a word or a concept, but happiness as a physical state, as a warm and specific weight in her chest, as the exact feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be. Jasper brought biscuits to the table and sat down and caught her looking at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that direct, warm gaze. "You're thinking something." "I was thinking," she said, "about the first morning I rode up to your gate." Something shifted in his face. "What about it?" "I asked for 1 season," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Clara had moved on from the ground squirrel to some other matter equally urgent. William turned a page. "Yes," Jasper said. "You never mentioned it ending," she said. He held her eyes across the table. "No," he said, "I never did." "Why not?" she asked, even though she knew. She wanted to hear him say it. He looked at her for a long moment with the full, open attention that she had learned over 10 years was the rarest and most valuable thing about him. "Because," he said simply and completely, "I didn't want it to." William looked up from his book. Clara stopped talking. The morning light lay across the table, and the biscuits steamed, and outside the cottonwoods were gold along the creek, and the meadowlark called from the south pasture, the way it had called every spring since she had first come to this valley with nothing and found, against all reasonable expectation, that the land would give her more than she had asked for, more than she had known how to ask for. "Pa," said Clara, with a child's unerring instinct for the significant, "are you and Mama talking about when she came here?" "Yes," Jasper said, not looking away from Eudora. "Before me and William," Clara said. "Before you and William," he confirmed. Clara thought about this seriously. "Were you lonely before?" she asked. Jasper looked at his daughter then with a softness that still surprised Eudora every time she saw it, this man who had been so contained and so careful and who had been unmade gradually and completely by love. "I was," he said honestly. "And then I wasn't." Clara nodded, satisfied. She looked at Eudora. "Good thing you came," she said. Eudora put down her coffee cup and reached across the table and took Jasper's hand, and his fingers closed around hers the way they had in the church on their wedding day, and the way they had every time since, with a steadiness that was not performance but character, not habit but choice, renewed every day in the specific and practical and entirely real language of a man who showed love by showing up. "Yes," she said. "Good thing." Outside, the October Kansas wind moved through the cottonwoods and sent the gold leaves spiraling, and the meadowlark called once more and then was quiet, and the sun came through the window and lay warm across the table where they sat together, all of them, in the life they had built from a single season that had never been allowed to end. The following spring, Eudora discovered she was carrying their 3rd child, and when she told Jasper, he stood on the porch in the April morning looking at the daffodils that had come back again, as they did every year, faithful and extravagant, and he said nothing for a moment and then turned to her with the fullest version of that expression, the open, wondering, completely undone look, and said, "We are going to need a bigger kitchen table." She laughed. The kind of real laugh that had started in a squash field 10 years ago, surprised out of her by a man she had not planned on, in a valley she had come to by accident, on land she had asked for 1 season and received for a lifetime. The baby came in November, a boy they named Samuel James Slater, James for Eudora's father, fat and healthy and immediately opinionated, with Jasper's dark hair and Eudora's gray eyes, and William was solemnly thrilled and Clara was magnificently bossy about it, and Jasper held his 3rd child with the same careful wonder he had held the first, and this time he did not say he didn't know how to do this. He knew. He had learned. The land or the love, one or the other, had taught him. The years after that were the years of a full life, complicated and joyful and real in all the ways that matter. The farm continued. The children grew. William, at 16, was riding with Jasper and learning the cattle operation with a seriousness that told you he intended to continue it. Clara, at 14, was in the fields with Eudora with a competence that was both inherited and entirely her own. She had a feel for the soil that was instinctive, a natural talent that Eudora recognized because she had it herself. Samuel, at 7, was everywhere and interested in everything, including his father's horses and his mother's greenhouse and his sister's bossiness and his brother's rope work, which he attempted with more enthusiasm than accuracy. On the 15th anniversary of the day Eudora had ridden up to Jasper Slater's gate with her broken wagon and her cow, they walked the south field at dawn together. The field was resting. They rotated the parcels now with a systematic care that had improved the land measurably over the years, and the grass was growing back through it in the way of good fallow land, thick and green, the earth beneath dark and rich. They walked without speaking for a while, the way they walked best. "Do you remember," she said finally, "what you said that first morning, about the ground being hard?" "I said you'd have to break it," he said. "I said I'd broken hard ground before," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You had." "I had," she agreed. She looked at the field. "It's different now." "It is," he said. 15 years of work will do that." She looked at him. He was the same and different. The dark hair had some gray in it now. The lines around his eyes were deeper, the jaw just as decided. But there was something in him that had not been there when she arrived, or that had been there and buried and was now visible, a ease. A warmth that sat on the surface rather than being guarded several layers down. The man the solitude had been conserving, waiting for the right conditions to become fully himself. "Jasper," she said. "Yes. I'm glad I asked for that season." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He looked at her with everything he was, all of it, unguarded, unreserved. "I'm glad you rode up to that gate," he said. She took his hand, and they stood in the fallow field in the early light, the meadowlark calling from the south pasture, the sound of the ranch stirring behind them, the children and the animals and the work and the life, all of it, the whole abundant, impossible, specific, real thing. And the sun came up over the Kansas plain the way it always had and always would, indifferent and magnificent, laying its light across the land that had given them both more than either had known how to ask for. She had asked for one season. He had said take it, and neither of them had ever once mentioned it ending, because some things when they are right do not end. They just deepen, the way good land deepens under years of care, layer by layer, season by season, becoming richer than anything a single spring could have promised or contained. They stood in the field and held hands as the sun rose, and it was enough. It was everything. It was the whole of it, complete and closed and full. A life made from a single brave question, and the answer of a quiet man who had been waiting, in his solitary and careful way, for exactly this.